So first and foremost, thank you everyone for being here, for having an interest in this topic of accelerating your growth, specifically through the leaders of your organization. We've got a lot of just really, really fun, exciting concepts to share with you. So before we get into it, I want to just introduce, I think most of you know most of us, but I want to give Mary and Mike an opportunity to each introduce themselves. So Mary, why don't you go first? Mary's one of our founders. Thank you for being here today. Do you want to just kind of introduce yourself to the people who aren't familiar with you and talk about today's topic?
Absolutely. Well, it's nice to meet those of you who I don't already know. And for many of you, you probably know me as the previous founder and owner of Core Talent, which I led for over 14 years. And back in April of this year, I merged Core Talent with Mike Frommelt's business, Keystone Executive Search. And one of the reasons, probably the primary reason why we decided to merge is that we share the same passion. And that passion is in developing our own people in our organizations, in their leadership skills so that they could take our companies, beyond us. Because Mike and I are basically on that same exit strategy path. And we realized that passion and our ability to bring our teams together would only strengthen our new company, Strategic Talent Partners, and help us ultimately get where we want to be, better and faster. So super excited to share some of our concepts, with you today that we not only use with our clients, but that we also use, within our own business, Strategic Talent Partners. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary. So, Mike, you set up beautifully by Mary. Anything you want to add?
I was just going to say, very well said. Very well said. Thank you very much. Yeah. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Frummelt. You may know me, as Mary said, from my previous firm, Keystone Search. I started that company in 2002, and as Mary said, owned that company up until April 1st of this year when we did the merger. At Keystone, we were focused on C-level search and worked with privately held companies across the country in really placing those most senior leaders in organizations. And myself, I've been working with privately held companies at an executive level for about 30 years. So I'm really excited to be here today and to share some of the experiences that I've had and that we've had along the way in terms of some great success stories of companies that have been able to build growth leadership teams and also share just some of the pitfalls maybe about some of the challenges of building these teams and making sure that you're creating that kind of sustainable success and growth.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. So I'll quickly introduce myself as well. My name is Rick Brettmaster. I lead our leadership solutions team. And so for those of you who are just getting familiar with Strategic Talent Partners, probably more touch points with the executive search team, right? Bringing executive talent into an organization. What my team is focused on is how do we make sure that the current leaders still in the organization are set up for success and have the skills and the right mindset and the right tools to be able to drive growth, like you said, Mike, sustainably and in a healthy fashion. And so it's just been a blast working with many of you on the call and deeply honored to have some new names and faces here as well. And so thank you again for your time and interest in this topic. I want to also just quickly call out Sophie. So Sophie is muted and off camera. You don't have to introduce yourself, Sophie. I don't want to put you on the spot. Sophie's going to be managing the chat, might call out questions from time to time. So just from a logistical perspective, if you do have a question, I think you're muted right now. So put it in the chat. Sophie will make sure that it gets addressed. I also have the chat up and running. So when I can get to questions, I will address them live as well. But we want to make sure you get what you want to out of this webinar. So let us know what questions come up. All right, so in terms of what we're going to cover over the next 55 minutes or so, we're going to talk about how to accelerate your business growth, but do it in a way that you're also equipping your leaders up for long-term success. And it's not an either or topic. It's really a both and. If you want to accelerate your growth, you really have to know what your leaders need and what are the right tools and skills that they can leverage in order to drive long-term and sustained success. And the way that we're going to get to that goal is we'll cover the three objectives you see on the screen. So we'll talk a little bit about what this challenge looks like at a high level, right? Share some stories around companies that we've worked with. And, if you just take Mike and Mary's experience and you kind of ball them up into some consistent themes, what are some of the common struggles that we see? And then for that second objective, we're going to dive deep into three specific challenges, right? Very common, almost assured challenges that a growing, thriving organization will run into at some point in time, and then equip you with some ideas or some insights that will help you, if not sidestep, work through those challenges much more efficiently and effectively. And then if you've been in one of my workshops before, and there's a handful of you that have, you know that it's a passion of mine not to leave the insights in the webinar or leave the ideas in the workshop. We want to make sure there's something that we can take with us back to the real world, right? When we log off this webinar and we start leading people again, what are we going to do differently, right? How are we going to be more equipped moving forward? And so we'll get you to commit to at least one action to leverage the insights from today's session. Now, I just talked about things I like to do in my sessions, right? If you have been in a session, you also probably know I love starting it off with a quote. I almost do it with every single webinar and session that I host. We have two really good quotes for you. And the first one, I want to give credit to Mike. So Mike has done a lot of work with EOS Worldwide, has a lot of great relationships, and was at a talk that Gino was leading. Was it last year, Mike? I want to say it was last year.
Yep.
And he shared this quote that the number one thing a company can do to achieve greatness is have a strong leadership team. And it's just such a perfect mindset for today's conversation, because really that's what we're talking about, is making sure you have that right core group of leaders and that you're setting that core group of leaders up for success. Because once that core gets established, a lot of good things start to happen. And then for some of you, the second quote might be interesting or appealing. And even if you're not in the process of thinking about selling your business, there is this growing desire to have more independence, right? Not have the business revolve solely around me, the executive, and start to really build out structures within your organization, create leaders that can manage with a little less day-to-day guidance. And when you get that in place, again, a lot of good things start to happen. The value of your business grows up, the day-to-day involvement goes down. And so we're really passionate about making sure executives have what they need out of their leadership team so they can get the business to where they believe is its full potential. So I'll do a lot of the talking today because I'm going to speak to some of the concepts and share some of the stories about work we're doing with current clients that we've done in the past. But Mike and Mary are going to chime in at specific points and share their wisdom and expertise because they know a lot. And so to get us started, Mike, would you just speak to this graphic and what you've seen out of some of our clients in the past?
Sure. Yeah, this is something that kind of relates to sort of a phenomenon that I noticed that, as I mentioned, I've been working with, privately held companies now for almost 30 years. And one of the things that I started noticing fairly early on in working with these companies was this growth dilemma, or this dilemma of a company outgrowing the leadership team. So as I mentioned, my experience has primarily been in C-level placement. And so when we would come in to do a search for whatever that position was, a COO or CFO or whatever it was, we always start with what we call discovery process. We start with spending time with the owner or the CEO, really to do a deep dive on the business. And then we will always meet with the senior leadership team as well, and typically meet with them one-on-one. And when I do that with the owner, one of the questions, of course, that I'll ask is, what's the size of the business? And they'll say that the business is $30 million or $50 million or $100 million or whatever it is. And then I'll go meet with the senior leadership team. And a lot of times, this is very consistent. A lot of times what I'm seeing is that you're seeing, I would end up meeting with the leadership team, and I'd kind of be scratching my head at the end saying, how in the world did this, does the company get to $50 million with sort of that $20 million leadership team. I'd meet with the CFO, and the capabilities there. My feeling on the capabilities of their CFO was, this person could really run a $20 million a year finance organization, and their sales leader maybe was a $15 million organization. And it just didn't feel like the leadership team was even at the level of where the business was. And what I realized fairly quickly was that was because of the owner and oftentimes entrepreneur. They were making up for kind of the lack of not just accountability, but capability across the senior leadership team. And so what this is showing is that, oftentimes we'll see this where, maybe that owner and CEO is actually, doing 25% of kind of that senior sales role. They're really, taking 30% of kind of the operations role, 40% of the finance role, maybe 60% of the marketing role. And these are just examples, and it can be any mix across here. But the important thing to understand is that the entrepreneur, owner, CEO is really kind of filling in those gaps on the leadership team. And especially at the strategic level, you're really seeing that the entrepreneur owner is really the strategic leader for all of these functions. And so it's not hard to understand then why a company would get stuck in terms of their growth, because what ends up happening is that entrepreneur is spending so much time in the functional areas of the business, they're really not focusing on the things that they do best for the business, which is really providing that vision and that higher level growth type of perspective.
I love this diagram, Mike. I love hearing you explain it. And even if you go back to those quotes that we were just looking at on the previous slide, I think it's easy to sit back and go, yeah, like I get it. A strong leadership team is going to help my business be more successful and help my business be more valuable. And this highlights that in reality, it's not like flipping a light switch. It actually takes a lot of time and energy and really expertise in terms of how you build up that senior leadership team.
And I think sometimes as entrepreneurs, we sort of do this to ourselves too. I think sometimes when we're building the business, when we are very small, we get a lot of accolades for kind of knowing everything about the business and being able to see around corners. And we, you can hear it from our employees on how great it is that we know so much about the business. But at some point in time, when we get to that stage, especially when we get a little more mature in the business and we're looking to do other things, maybe even outside of the business, or as I said before, spending more time really on how do we take this from a $30 million company to a $60 million company, all of a sudden you're in the weeds and not able to really focus on the key things of taking the business forward. And this is a big reason I found that organization's going to get stuck.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing, Mike. All right, Mary, I love hearing your story of how organizations evolve their thinking around what leadership looks like. So would you just breathe some life into what we see on the screen here?
Yeah, so I'm going to flip the switch now a little bit and talk more about the leadership team and the challenges that we see over and over again in a growing company. So, we place, as Mike said, we place leaders in privately held entrepreneurial growing companies. And most oftentimes it's because there's a gap or a perceived gap in the organization. And during our discovery process, we're asking a lot of questions, and we tend to find a lot of similar patterns. A company is successful, they've reached that whatever number it is, 20 million, 50 people, whatever, because they did really good work and they had a solid leadership team put into place. And then the company started growing or continued to grow, and they added a number of employees. And what often happens is those employees just keep piling up under the existing leaders. And we call that span of control, how many direct reports report into a people leader. And I think most of you are probably familiar with the stats on this, that it really is between 5 and 9 people is ideal in terms of having those direct reports. 5 being the best scenario, which almost never happens. And it makes sense, right? If you have 5 people that report to you, you have more time to spend with them. But we see teams that are getting into the double digits, and that can become very problematic just because there's just not enough capacity to lead those people. The other thing that we see is as a company is growing, they're adding new functions, new positions, and those again are being put under existing leaders. So now a leader's, number of people reporting to them is growing at the same time that they're having to manage multiple functional areas. We see this a lot with IT. It's a perfect example. IT tends to go under either finance or operations, and oftentimes the leader of those organizations have never led an IT, team. And if, especially if they don't have a strong leader in place for IT, now they're having to not only get up to speed on all things technology, but also trying to find time to manage those people. And again, we see this over and over and over, and it is a huge dilemma. And oftentimes what happens is these leaders at the top, they just get burned out. They start feeling ineffective at their jobs because they're just spread so thin. So we're super excited today, because this sounds pretty hopeless, right? But it's not, because we're excited to talk about some strategies that will really help build leadership capacity at that top level, but also push down that leadership capacity throughout the organization.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I mean, I just think of conversations that you and I have had with these business leaders, and you feel that weight on their shoulders, right? And everyone's trying really hard. Everyone's operating with good intentions. And one story that comes to mind, which is a conversation that you and I were both in, we asked a leader, what was the ideal outcome? And the response was, I'd like it to be more like it was in 2016, right?
Yeah,
And so
yep,
there's almost this desire to like pull time back and go back to a simpler organizational structure with less people and just like less people challenges, but you can't go back.
right.
You got to figure out how to move forward. So it's just so well said. Thank you. All right. So Mike and Mary, I think it was very clear, at least it was very clear to me, ton of wisdom and experience. Thank you for sharing at a high level what we're going to be talking about today. I'm excited to incorporate some of your thoughts around some of these challenges specifically. For the rest of us, we're going to spend the majority of our time now diving into these specific challenges. And we chose these challenges purposefully because these are challenges that we address, if not weekly, on a daily basis with the organizations that we work with. And so part of the intent with today's webinar is number one, just to normalize these challenges, right? Like if you're experiencing some of the challenges that you see on the screen, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means your business is actually growing and doing well, right? Like these are problems that growing organizations experience because they're growing. It's, that growing pain manifests them in the challenges that you're seeing on the screen. But part of our mission, part of our purpose is not to let them linger and fester in organizations, is to really equip leaders and senior leaders with the right solution to get through some of these challenges as efficiently as possible. And as it said on the previous screen, when left unaddressed, right, good people, they can leave. And so that's absolutely don't want that. And so I'm going to dive into our first challenge, which is unclear company needs. And at its simplest level, oh, were you going to say something, Mary? Nope. Okay, you're good. At its simplest level, what we see is that, if we're talking to a new client, right? I'll just kind of use a story here for a second. We'll often ask them about their business plan, right? And there is just a tremendous amount of care and attention that they have put into their business plan. They have these very clear initiatives that they're working on, and they can tell you what their, company goals are from a 10, 5-year, 3-year perspective. And then we'll ask them, who's going to do this work? Like, how are you going to actually execute? and it's much less clear. It's like, well, we're working on that, or we're going to just step up and we're going to figure it out like we always have. And that's not to admonish anyone who's used that strategy, but it is an opportunity to maybe step back and say, would we have more confidence in our business plan if we had a clear understanding in terms of the talent necessary to be successful? And so, to leverage the content that you see on the screen here, what we're really good at, what we have done throughout the entirety of Core Talent and Keystone's existence, is helping leaders think through the impact that their growth is going to have on their organization. And like, let's just take the search side of the business, right? Whenever an opportunity comes to partner on an executive role, we will ask them, where are you going as an organization? Because as that top bullet points out, if your goal is to grow 10% year over year, that's going to require a different leader than if your goal is to grow 50% year over year. And so we got very good at helping executive teams think through not just what is the right skill set that they need to hire in, but what is the right mindset that this leader needs to have? What is the values alignment? How can they be a value, an add to our culture, and maybe not just a reinforcement of the norms that we already have? And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's when you're in the throes of trying to solve problems on a daily basis, it can be difficult to take a step back and know how to address what your company is going to need from a talent perspective in the future. And so, in terms of addressing this challenge, I want to call out three very specific questions or topics that you'd want to consider. The first thing that you'd want to consider is your growth trajectory. The second is, what is a realistic future accountability or org chart? And then the third is, what is my leadership team preparedness? And so, to add a little bit of insights in these areas, right, when we start thinking about growth trajectory, some of the main questions that you as leaders want to think about is really around the pace and the volume. So, pace being how quickly do we anticipate growing, and volume being how much do we anticipate growing. So, doesn't take an advanced math degree to say if we're going to have a large volume of growth that's going to happen at a fast pace, that's a lot of change that we need to start thinking about within our organization. We really need to drastically rethink the kind of talent that we need to be successful, because the size and the composure and the makeup of our organization is likely going to be changing in the very near future. In terms of a realistic org chart, one of the biggest challenges is just around scalability. We often find that there is a semblance of an org chart of the future, an accountability chart of the future, but there's not a clear understanding in terms of how to get from current state to that future state, right? And when you start to think about the bridge required between those two organizational charts, there are simple things you can do either to set yourself up for success or to modify the structure in a way that makes it much more likely you're going to scale that gap. Mike, you did an excellent job talking about leadership preparedness, and this is a very difficult thing for leadership teams to think about, right? And in some regards, it's existential. Do I have the ability to grow and meet the needs of the future organization? And so, while it might lead to some tough discussions, it is much easier to have that conversation prospectively rather than retrospectively. And so, by talking about preparedness, you can start to build in experiences and development that makes it more likely that you're not going to fall into that growth dilemma that Mike was talking about. And then the last is values and culture. And I'll just use a quick story to articulate this one. We were working with a client a couple years ago, and they had grown a lot, and they had found that some fairly significant silos started to emerge in their organization. And so, as they were growing, rather than people working collaboratively across the organization, which has historically been part of their culture, right? Everyone pitches in. Teams started to emerge, departments started to emerge, people didn't know each other. And at the end of the day, it was really a values issue, right? Their values weren't set up to encourage cross-functional collaboration. And so we helped them reorient their values so that people were more apt to collaborate with each other, to step outside of their normal day-to-day and engage with people outside of their teams. And so your values and culture often needs to expand as well. Now, I've talked for probably 5-7 minutes straight. Mary, Mike, I'm curious, does anything stand out from your perspectives or any stories come to mind around this topic or this challenge?
Well, I'd like to just touch on letter B, the realistic org chart, because I think organizational design is a very complex talent, skill.
Yeah.
There's a reason that companies like Deloitte and McKinsey and Accenture can charge millions of dollars to large corporations to get these structures right. But really, it's not about just putting people in places and then just adding layers underneath, right? It's about looking at an organizational structure and how to best support the business as the business changes, and to, put in a structure that maximizes efficiencies, and one that is not creating more confusion, than needed. And so
Mhm.
if you don't have people with expertise in organizational design, I would really encourage you to seek that out, because it is a special skill set, and it's a very important part of your business growth strategy when it comes to your people.
Yeah, very well said, Mary.
I would agree with that 100%. And I would also say that just some things about kind of realistic growth and really looking at, what really does it mean to go, to go to 3 times or 5 times or 10 times where we're at today. It seems like lately, and a lot of the conversations that I'm having, it seems somehow that $100 million is sort of this magic number that a lot of companies are trying to reach, and it doesn't matter if they're 2 million today or 10 million today. They're all talking about, but we're going to $100 million, and that's not to say that you can't do that, but really taking the time to look at, well, what would that really take, from a talent perspective, and from a strategy perspective, and our products and our sales and everything, on what would it really take to get there, and then making sure that building those along the way. As Rick said, it's you have to sort of think of that gap between the two. How do we go from one to the next? Because it doesn't happen overnight.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't. No, doesn't. Okay, so we want to make this webinar engaging, right? If you're scrolling on another web browser, this would be your cue to bring your eyes back to the screen, into the webinar presentation here. I am curious. Well, let's use the raise your hand function. So I just pressed it, right? It's this little hand. Raise your hand if you've talked about all 4 of these topics as a leadership team. I can see. Okay. Brandon. Good for you, Brandon. Somehow that doesn't surprise me. Okay, now raise your hand if you talked about all 3 of the 4. Oh, Mary. Nice. Good. Practice what we preach. I like that. George. 2 of the 4. 1 of the 4. Okay, there's no shame in this question. You're actually proving one of the points that we made at the beginning of the webinar, which is that this stuff is hard, right? And these challenges are common. So hopefully, with the exception of Brandon's perfect. I don't know why you're here, Brandon. The rest of us have something we can take away with. And so let's do one more quick exercise.
Rick, just real quick,
Yeah.
I did raise my hand for all 4. I just
Oh,
didn't
you
take it
did?
off.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. There is probably a credibility point
Yeah,
where we needed to say we had
exactly.
all 4 of them. Yeah. So in the chat, now let's use the chat function, okay? Where are you most certain? So we have A, B, C, and D. Where do you feel most confident about your ability as an organization, or maybe where have you spent the most time discussing these as a leadership team? Mary, thank you. Okay, we've got a D. I'm verbalizing the responses for the AI bots so they can summarize effectively. And just as a total aside, I think this is the first webinar I've ever facilitated where a part of the audience is not human. Okay, so I see a C, D. So we've got a small sample size, but C and D seem to be where we're most certain. How about least certain? Anybody want to take a stab and say, where could I spend some more time and energy with my leadership team or with the leaders in my organization discussing? All right, so A, C, C. C is a tricky one. C is a tricky one. I'll give you credit for putting those in the response. Thank you. Hopefully this was helpful, right? Start to clarify what these challenges look like in your organization. So just a quick case study for you, and then I'm going to get into the second challenge. One of our clients, flooring manufacturer, wonderful organization, really strong leaders at the top of the company, but half of the leadership team is new. So they're still getting familiar with the company, what the company's strategies are, still kind of meshing into the culture of the organization. And they came to us and they said, Rick, I'd like you to make sure that the leadership team is working well together. So we went through this exercise with them, and it was a fascinating experience because at the end of the day, they're a manufacturer, right? So if you were to just kind of put your finger in the air and say, where do they need to add headcount in their organization? Your chances are you're probably going to say operations, because they need to make sure that they're building the materials so that they can ship the stuff out and drive the revenue. After going through this exercise, however, they realized they're really understaffed in sales. And if they are going to have any chance of being successful in their revenue goals, they needed to staff up, mature their sales organization, make sure they had boots on the ground to drive the opportunities to get the revenue they needed to grow. And so it's just a really neat exercise to drive insights you wouldn't have immediately guessed, create alignment at that leadership team, clarify the strategy in terms of what the company needs to achieve its growth goals. All right, challenge number 2, flat versus growth leadership. So you probably heard us use the term growth leadership a handful of times for sure in this webinar. If you follow us on LinkedIn, we're starting to talk more about it. We're really excited about this concept of growth leadership. And so let me just articulate a little more about what growth leadership is, and even at the highest level, what does it look like? And what we have found in terms of describing good, healthy leadership in a growing organization, it's actually easiest to articulate what it looks like in contrast with what we call flat leadership. Now, one of the important takeaways from what you see on the screen here, flat leadership isn't necessarily bad. It's just not set up to drive growth-based activities. And so if you are looking to grow your business, flat leadership is not going to get you where you want to go. And Mary kind of talked about some of the challenges around how executives make decisions, putting people into leadership roles. That's a huge area of opportunity for many growing organizations, is to be a little more thoughtful and purposeful about who we elevate into those leadership roles. Because often, if we're making decisions out of convenience or out of a sense of hurriness, we settle for flat leadership. We settle for the people who are really, they really know their stuff, right? Mike, I think you said it the best. You are celebrated because you have so much subject matter expertise. That is a huge benefit to a growing organization, up to the point where, as a leader becomes a little bit more disconnected from the day-to-day operations, they're no longer in touch with the actual subject matter expertise, the contemporary understanding of what good looks like at the shop floor on the front line. And so that subject matter expertise that was the key to that person's elevation can actually start to become a choke point over time. Like I said, another client we worked with, they were growing, weren't purposeful about who they were elevating into leadership, and silos started to emerge, right? Like just kind of stick to what you're good at rather than work cross-functionally in an organization. One of the big things we see in contrast with flat leadership and growth leadership is just this idea that change is good, right? Like we need to rethink how we do things. And flat leaders will often regress to the norm. They like things to kind of stay a little bit more static, a little bit more comfortable, versus growth leaders who are really driven by figuring out solutions to problems, and interested in doing things a little bit different and continuous improvement. And so, the idea of growth leadership, we'll touch on that a couple more times as we get deeper into this webinar, but it's easiest to understand growth leadership when you use flat leadership as a contrast. Now, the key points that I want to leave you with at this slide is that if you're a growth-based company, you really need growth-based leaders. It is not viable to expect continued sustainable growth by consistently relying on flat leadership. You will start to see challenges. Some of the other challenges that we're discussing will start to emerge and really slow down your growth. And the risks really are that you're limiting your ability to step into that future org structure. You're limiting your ability to stretch and to scale. And left unaddressed, we touched on a couple of these, but I think the one that stands out in terms of the conversations that I typically had is that you start to lose good people. And often that is a point where they come knocking on our door and they say, Rick or Mike or Mary, we just can't lose any more good people. It's starting to hurt really bad, and we can often help in that regard. So a little story around this challenge. We are currently working with a transportation holding company. And this holding company, they have 6 individual businesses, and each business has a president and a vice president that really manages the business from P&L ownership and then day-to-day operations. And this business had grown fast. They've experienced a lot of success, but they were starting to teeter on maybe we don't have the right people in leadership roles in order to sustain our success. And so we were brought in and we were asked to do some assessment work, some 360 survey work, and then some executive coaching. And it's just been a delight to work with this client. And one of the things that we've really made a lot of progress on is how do you start to differentiate between your technical expertise, right? The expertise you built by growing your career in this industry versus the skill sets required to set your team up for sustained success. And so some of the things that we're working on, some of the areas of progress that we've made, leaders are much better at holding other leaders accountable. So these are senior executives, and they're starting to really push responsibility down to the right level of the organization rather than treating everything as it needs to roll up to the vice president or the president. One of the clients has started to think about change management. So that's like one of the biggest wins, right? Not only is this leader starting to embrace the leadership skills necessary to be successful, he's starting to act in ways that is preparing the organization for some upcoming changes. And then, one of the things that I'm most proud of is that the presidents and the vice presidents of these businesses, they're starting to hold their executives accountable. So that holding company, they're starting to say, well, if we're going through this process and we're working on leadership skills, we'd love to see you do it too, right? And we want to have a more collaborative relationship with the holding company as well. And so it is a really nice example of how when you make progress in one area, it can lead to progress in other areas of a company as well. Okay, but wait, there's more. I think if you're here, you're going to get this tool in your inbox. And so this is a tool we use, and it is specifically designed to help identify where you as an individual leader, where a leader on your team, maybe the leadership team or the leadership culture of your organization, where are you strong? And then how important are those skills for your organization? And the takeaway from a tool like this is it's a very easy to use and functional assessment. So you have this clear understanding in terms of what are the skills that I need to be successful, and then what are the pain points, the skills I need to improve upon. And that can quickly turn into impactful development opportunities. So if you know that building effective teams is both a weak spot and an important skill for your organization, you can start to do something about it with that leader. So, you can take a screenshot if you want. You'll also get a PDF of this tool in your inbox as a thank you for participating in today's webinar. All right, so let's talk about the third challenge, and that's really around outdated systems and processes. I think we work a lot with clients that use operating systems. We already talked about EOS, for example, in that quote at the beginning. I've talked for, 10 minutes straight now. Mike and Mary, I'm curious, when you think about this challenge in terms of using systems and making sure systems are up to date and where they need to be in order to help an organization continue to grow. What stands out to you as important on this topic? What have you learned around, helping our clients think about systems in their organization?
Well, I would say it's iterative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just like our internal processes. We have to be constantly looking at them, making them better, making them more efficient. And the same thing applies to our people processes. And I do believe that many organizations, especially if you're running on EOS and you put your HR processes in place and you get things documented and you put them on the shelf, kind of like an employee handbook, and never to be touched again, right? And I think, the people systems, tools, and processes are one of the most critical areas to be looking at pretty much every year,
Mm-hmm.
especially as you're growing and at whatever pace you're growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I often think that gaps limit growth. That's a area that you and I talk about a lot, right? And if you kind of pick and choose which ones you address, you might leave a system totally unaccounted for. And I've learned a lot from you, Mary, in terms of thinking holistically about the systems that we need to grow.
Yeah. I would add to that and just say that, yeah, like you said, Rick, we work with a lot of organizations that run EOS. We run EOS ourselves, and I think it's great at forcing you to document your processes. And I think one thing that gets missed is thinking about what's our process for leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in EOS, we're thinking about it in terms of what's our process for a function or for a project or for other various parts of the organization, but not thinking about leadership as its own entity that needs to also have processes
Mm-hmm.
on how are we continuing to improve our leadership and making sure we're doing that in a systematic way.
Yeah, yeah, excellent, Mike. And it's a great segue to the right-hand side of the screen, which are these triggers that I need to be thinking about where I'd need to address my leadership systems, right? And these are often situations where our phone starts to ring. And sometimes it's going into one of these changes, right? We're planning on adding leaders, we're planning on adding a layer. More often than not, it's on the back end, right? And our phone has certainly come where it's like we just went through a large change, really exposed some of the challenges we have around leadership. Can you help us think about a better way to do this? There was a client that reached out a couple years ago and they were worried about losing frontline employees. So they were most interested in the skill sets, kind of what we were talking about in challenge two. We ended up doing a lot of system work with that client because they needed a regular and repeatable way to make sure that their leaders were using a good process to manage their people effectively and keep those strong performers in the organization. So, if you take a step back, like Mary and Mike have said, we've worked with a lot of growing organizations. We have a pretty strong sense in terms of what are the systems that are required for success as you're scaling and growing your business and looking to do that in a sustainable way. We also read a lot. We spend a lot of time thinking about talent management as a body of research. We're up to date in terms of what are the current best practices and the trajectories in terms of what the research is educating us. These are the systems that we know are critical to good leadership in an organization. There's a lot on this slide. I'm not gonna I could talk for a long time about each of these systems. If you're looking for, I don't know, a 4-hour podcast, that's maybe coming down the road. Today, I will just say it's really helpful to have understanding on the breadth of the systems. And then as a quick gut check, it's useful to know to what level of sophistication do we need in our organization? Do we need something at the strategic level? Or for the next 12, 18, 24 months, could we get by with something at the foundational level? Very, very useful tool to take a complex topic and break it down into these kind of bite-sized, digestible bits around leadership systems. And just to kind of articulate how this document can get put into practice, this is A real example, it's been adjusted slightly, but this is a real example of a client of ours who used this document and said, okay, here's where we're already equipped, right? Here's where we're acceptable in terms of our level of ability. Here are things we've already committed to in the organization. And some of these were direct. You told us we needed to work on this, so we're going to work on it. Some of it was indirect. In order to achieve this goal, we must advance in this area. And then this client actually went above and beyond and said, based on our strategic plan, here are other things that we need to have on our roadmap. Not this year, but we need to stay focused on in order to be successful in our business plan. So this is a cool way of thinking about this exact tool. All right, so like I said, what is growth leadership? We're talking about it a lot. It's a way of articulating what a leader needs to embrace, not just at an individual level, but really at a company level in order to build confidence in your business plan. And so we originally introduced this actually at the EOS conference down in San Diego. Mike and I presented together there, and it was a lot of fun sharing. Wanted to reprise this slide specifically because if you take all of those challenges, and if you were to try and create sort of like a line between each of the challenges in terms of what can you do as an executive to minimize the risk associated with those challenges, we shared a lot of ideas, right? A lot of little concepts. The theme, if you wrap it all together, is you start to look for, celebrate, and recognize growth leadership in your organization. And so growth leadership at its core is that your leadership in your organization has the right mindset. And what we mean by that is that when they show up on a daily basis, they think of themselves as leaders. That is actually a huge challenge that we help our clients with is, they've made decisions out of convenience or necessity over time, and they have flat leaders in place. And so we reorient and we make sure the leaders in those leadership roles that they have that right mindset, that they embrace the responsibilities, they have a concrete understanding of what it means to lead others. They also have the right skill sets. So we spent a fair amount of time talking about skill sets, right? And that's that tool you're going to get in your email inbox. They know the skills they need in order to be successful, and they have the systems in place in order to execute, right? It's not a guessing game. They know exactly when and where they use those skills to make sure that their team is getting the support that they need, and they're building confidence in your organization's ability to grow. So in terms of how the growth leadership model helps companies, clarifies or defines what those leadership skills and behaviors are. So that mindset and that skill set starts to become much easier to identify. The expectations start to fall into place. So leaders know what they need to do on a regular basis. They have a process for leading people, and those things add up for sustainable and effective growth, right? You can step back, you get that independence, you have confidence in that strong leadership team that we were talking about at the very beginning of the webinar.
And Rick, I would add, mindset is at the bottom for a reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Without the right mindset as a leader, none of the rest of it will work. I mean,
Yeah.
and we've seen it time and time again. If you have a leader that has the right mindset and they have mostly the skill set, they can be further developed. And then having the systems, tools, and processes to assist
Mm-hmm.
them and sustaining their leadership abilities, is what is going to help your organization grow.
Yeah, very well said, Mary. Very well said. All right, I'm following the chat. So it looks like not everyone has been able to ask questions. For I'm not sure what the reason being. Um, if you do have a question, this would be a great time to ask it because really all we have left in terms of content is a wrap up and then a quick overview slide. Okay, so Brandon asked the question, what's the best way to implement growth leadership? So I'll just talk about that right now. Growth leadership, we don't think of it necessarily as a tool. We would more so think of it as a way to holistically address the needs of your leadership team. And so one of the ways that we start a partnership where a company wants to really embrace growth leadership is by doing an organizational assessment. And you got a little taste of it today, right? Like you probably got some sneak peek in terms of the insights that the organizational assessment provides. But that's really a deeper dive into further clarifying what are the specific priorities that we need to be focused on as a company. That organizational assessment, you're highlighting some of our current partnerships, Brandon, clarifies how to leverage some of the tools that we have to support organizational growth. So you reference our talent calibrator process. You can see that's highlighted here in the equip phase, right? After you do the assessment, then you can start working on this equipping leaders, doing the skills, making sure that you're selecting the right leaders for future leadership positions. And then after you get through that equip phase, then you turn into the sustain phase, which is overwhelmingly focused on systems, right? Making sure you've got the right systems at that right level of sophistication to set your organization up for continued growth. It's a great question, Brandon. Thank you. I appreciate you asking. All right, I'm gonna go back a slide for a second. So I promised everyone would walk away with at least one thing to think about, one thing to work on. It's important to me that your time is well spent. So you have 3 prompts. You don't have to answer all 3 of them, but I want you to answer one of them. And I want you to think about how you can make the most value out of this content. You've now sat with us for 51 minutes. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two, or at least had something reinforced in terms of it's important. If you're bold, I want you to put it in the chat. And I want you to get credit for your insight. And then also, I bet you there's other people who could learn from either your aha or the action you commit to. So again, that's my challenge to you. And then I want you to come up with a challenge for yourself. And then maybe while we're waiting, Mike, you're off mute. I'm going to call on you. You listened to me talk. We've had many conversations. What stands out to you? What would you walk away with or want people to walk away with?
Yeah, if we've been talking around this, but I would say, I would encourage you to think about your leadership almost as you'd think about one of the functions of your business. So if you're an owner, you probably know pretty well, like to get to our goal, whatever that might be, we're going to need to sell X more product. We're going to need to make X more product or service X more, clients. You might even know how many employees it's going to take. We're going to have X amount of employees, but have you really thought about, we're also going to have to lead those employees, and how to, so really kind of setting leadership aside is really as a priority and actually a piece of the business that you focus on by itself, because it really is, how you're going to, affect, get the most out of the people that you do bring in, and make the most effective use of your business, and grow the fastest and the most sustainably.
Yeah, well said. I shouldn't ask a sage what their key insights are while I'm also asking participants to identify an action for themselves, but I do appreciate that. Mary, I'm going to pose the same challenge to you. If you just think about the conversation we've had so far this hour, what stands out to you?
Honestly, I was going to say the exact same thing. And Mike, you stated it so perfectly, but, and I think this is the hardest thing for organizations to figure out. And part of that, though, is because we don't spend enough time thinking about what does a good leader look like today. We all read books, we go to seminars, we hear a lot of things, but what does a successful growth-oriented leader look like in my organization? And I think, spending time really thinking about that is so important.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well said. Yeah, and Barry, I see your chat comment. Absolutely, right? Spotlighting, is this person in the right seat? Are they in the seat for the right reasons? A conversation implementers excel at. And so 100% agree with
I'd
that
like to
comment.
respond to Brandon's question about pushing this down through the organization.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You
Yeah.
know, we've done succession planning with an entire company of, 200 people. And so
Mhm.
it has to start at the top,
Yeah.
obviously, but yes, for sure it can be moved through down through the organization and really should be.
Well, and Mary, I'm glad you made that comment. I'm gonna, not that I haven't been on my soapbox this entire time, but I'm gonna purposely step on my soapbox for a second here. Succession planning is not who's gonna take my job. If you're in a growing organization, succession planning is as much, if not more, about who's gonna step up and fill future leadership roles, who's gonna assume some of the responsibility that I'm currently working on so I can work on the strategy and take the business to the next level. And so that's an area where I think we can add a lot of value. And it's often a touchy area at the beginning of a project. And then as we get deeper into it, the excitement and the opportunity starts to really build and grow because everybody wins when there's good succession planning in place.
Well, and honestly, back when I was talking through that slide of the challenges, right, of just putting more and more employees underneath a
Yeah,
leader, if
yeah.
we're building leadership capacity below us, then it doesn't matter how many people are there. As long as there are
Mhm.
leaders overseeing major, areas of work,
Mhm.
major bodies of work, that's when the magic happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well said.
One other thought, just, and this is for primarily for those entrepreneurs, owners again, is, I think it's easy when you look at a model like this flat leadership versus growth leadership to think about your functional heads or your team leaders and think, boy, I've got I must have a person must be a flat leader. But I also think it's important that you challenge yourself to think about what systems have you put in place to really help that leader improve.
Mhm.
And are they, as Mary was talking about earlier, they're kind of floundering out there because they've got too much on their plate and really haven't had the training or education on how to really lead people. So it goes both ways, and that's why I think the model is so compelling. In that you have to have the right individuals with the right motivations and right values, but you also have to have that system in place to make sure that they're getting better.
Excellent. All right. If you've been in a workshop of mine, you know that I tend to walk right up to the time limit, if not go a little bit past. I'm going to take a win and say we're close enough to the top of the hour. I think we said as much as we can share with you today. So the last thing is just to say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking an interest in this. Thank you for thinking about how to really set your teams up for success, maximize the capability that you have in your organization. If you have follow-up questions, case you didn't get this already, we like talking about this stuff. We would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. We're going to be sending the recording out as well. So if you think of someone who might value from hearing about these challenges or these ideas, please share freely. Whoever wants to have access can have access to this. But more than anything, appreciate your time and energy today and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.